The morning Graham Easton rode into Clearwater Flats with a foreclosure notice folded in his breast pocket. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the land stretched out in every direction like it had been there since before God had thought of names for things. He had done this before, of course. Ridden up to a homestead with papers that meant the end of everything for the people inside. He had learned not to think too hard about the faces that came to the door. He had learned to keep his voice measured, his expression neutral, his hat in his hands as a courtesy that cost him nothing. He had a system. He had words prepared, words that sounded almost gentle if you said them in the right order, with the right pause before the word unfortunately. It was 1882, and the Clearwater Flats territory of southern Kansas was not a gentle place. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, and with it had come men like Graham's employer, Harlan Voss, who owned the Voss Land and Capital Company out of Wichita. Voss had a talent for acquiring land that other men had borrowed against during good years and could not repay during bad ones. The drought of 1881 had been a bad year. For most of the small ranchers and farmers in a 100-mile radius, it had been the worst year they had ever seen. Graham had been working for Voss for 3 years. He was 28 years old, and he had not planned on this being his life. He had studied bookkeeping in Missouri, had come west with some notion of honest work in an honest place, and had somehow ended up as the man Voss sent when there were unpleasant things to be done with a professional air. It paid well. It required him to ride out alone, which suited a man who had grown accustomed to his own company. It required him to be firm but fair, which he told himself he was. He told himself a great many things on the long rides between Wichita and wherever the next notice needed delivering. The Merritt land was 340 acres on the eastern edge of the Clearwater Basin. Good land, actually, the kind that kept green a week longer than everything around it because of how the creek cut through the lower pasture. Graham had looked at the file the night before in the boarding house in Caldwell. James Merritt, deceased 14 months ago. A wife, one Lucy Merritt, age 26. 2 children listed, though the ages weren't written down. A promissory note taken with the Voss Company 3 years ago to cover the cost of a new well and fencing. 2 missed payments, a third that had come in late and partial. Under Voss's terms, 2 missed payments meant foreclosure proceedings could begin. He was not legally required to come out here in person. He could have sent the notice by post or handed it to the county sheriff in Caldwell to deliver on his rounds. But Voss insisted his men deliver foreclosures personally. He said it reduced the chance of legal contest. Graham suspected Voss simply liked knowing that a real person had to look another real person in the eye and say the words. The Merritt homestead came into view as the trail curved around a low rise of cottonwood trees. It was a modest place, a 2-story frame house that someone had once painted white, though the paint had weathered to the color of old bone. A large barn, well maintained. A kitchen garden that ran along the south side of the house in neat rows, even this late in October when most things had already been put up for the season. A windmill turning slowly in the morning air. Chickens scratching in the dirt near the fence line. Everything about the place said that someone was fighting hard to keep it alive. Graham dismounted at the gate, tied his horse to the post there, and stood for a moment adjusting his coat. He took a breath. He went through his words in his head the way he always did, setting them in order, making sure each one was ready when he needed it. He was good at this, he reminded himself. He was professional. He was not here to be anyone's enemy. He was simply here to deliver information that the recipient would not enjoy. He walked up the path to the front door and knocked twice. For a moment, nothing happened. He could hear movement inside, soft footsteps, something set down on a hard surface, a child's voice asking a question too low for him to make out. Then the door opened, and Lucy Merritt was standing there. He had not been prepared for her. That was the only honest way to account for what happened next. She was not remarkable in the way that would have made sense to explain it. She was not wearing anything fancy, a plain dark dress. a white apron that had flour on it, her dark hair pinned up but with pieces coming loose at the temples, the way hair does when a person has been working. She was perhaps 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with strong hands and a face that the sun had touched to the color of warm honey. Her eyes were brown, and they looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has learned to assess a stranger at the door very quickly and very accurately. But there was something in the set of her. Something that was tired and dignified at the same time. The way she held the door, not defensive, not welcoming, just present, like the land itself. Like something that had decided it was going to stay right where it was, no matter what the weather said. Graham opened his mouth to say the first words he had prepared, the ones about his name and who he represented, and that he was sorry to disturb her this morning. She said, "You look like you could use coffee." He blinked. It was not a question. It was an observation and an invitation wrapped in one sentence, delivered in a voice that was neither warm nor cold but simply matter of fact, as if she could see through his pressed coat and his practiced expression to the long, cold ride that had come before it. He stopped. The words he had prepared sat in his mind and did not move to his mouth. "Yes," he said, instead of any of them. "I suppose I could." She stepped back from the door and he walked inside, and whatever he had planned to say next, he could not find it anywhere. The inside of the house smelled like bread baking and wood smoke, and something that might have been dried lavender hung in bundles somewhere he couldn't see. The kitchen was clean and organized with the efficiency of a person who knows exactly what they have and where every bit of it is. A cast iron stove against the far wall was doing its work with a low, steady heat. 2 children were at the table, a boy who looked to be around 8, with his father's dark coloring judging by an old daguerreotype on the shelf, and a girl a year or 2 younger who was doing something with pieces of colored paper. "Sit down," Lucy said, moving to the stove without waiting to see if he would follow the instruction. He sat at the table. The boy looked at him with the serious, evaluating stare of a child who has learned that strange men arriving at the door are not always a good thing. The girl looked up briefly and then went back to her paper. "Thomas," Lucy said to the boy, "take your sister and go check on the chickens, please." Thomas looked at Graham for another moment, as if registering him in detail for future reference, and then got up from the table with the air of a person who obeys instructions, but does not consider the matter closed. He took his sister's hand and they went out through the back door, and then it was quiet except for the stove and the windmill outside. Lucy set a cup of coffee on the table in front of Graham. It was dark and hot and smelled like something that had been roasted with care. He wrapped both hands around the cup without meaning to. The warmth went through his palms and up into his arms, and something in his chest that had been held tight since he woke up that morning loosened just enough to be noticeable. She poured her own cup and sat across the table from him, and she looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and she said, "You're from the Voss Company." It was not a question either. "Yes," he said. "Graham Easton. I know what you are," she said. It came out without heat, which somehow made it land harder than if she had been angry. "I've been expecting someone for 2 months." He set down his cup. He should have taken out the notice right then, should have moved through the machinery of what he was there to do. That was the system. Move quickly, say the words, give them the document, give them the timeline, tell them the avenues available to them, few as they were, and ride out. Instead he said, "How long has your husband been gone?" She looked at him for a moment, perhaps recalibrating slightly. 14 months, she said. "A horse accident." He was moving cattle in the upper pasture and the horse went down in a gopher hole at a run. She said it plainly, the way a person says a thing they have said enough times that the rawness has been worked down to something they can carry. He didn't suffer long. "I'm sorry," Graham said. He said it a great deal in his line of work, and he had grown careful about it sounding rote. He wanted this one to mean something. He thought it probably did from the slight shift in her expression. "The payments," she said. "I know I'm behind. I had a buyer for half the cattle in the spring, and the price collapsed when the Hendersons to the north drove their herd through early and flooded the market." Then the well the money paid for went sailing on me in August. I had to dig a secondary well by hand with Thomas helping me because I couldn't afford a driller." She paused. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because if you're going to sit at my table and drink my coffee, you ought to know the truth of things." Graham looked at the flower on her apron and the calluses visible at the base of her fingers where they wrapped around the cup, and he thought about her digging a well in August in the Kansas heat, with an 8-year-old boy handing her buckets. The foreclosure notice in his breast pocket felt like it weighed 10 pounds. "The land is worth significantly more than the debt," he said, and then was surprised he had said it because it was not part of what he had prepared. "I know that," she said. "That's why your employer wants it." She was not wrong. Voss had been eyeing the Merritt land specifically because the creek access made it valuable for a cattle operation he was assembling along the basin. Graham had not thought about it in quite those terms until she said it out loud. "What's the number?" she asked. "What I owe to bring it current." $212, he said, "plus penalties, which brings it to $240. She nodded slowly. She looked down at her coffee cup. Something moved across her face and then was gone, tucked away somewhere inside her with the practiced economy of a woman who does not let herself fall apart in front of strangers. "I have $38, she said. "I have a calf that will be ready to sell in the spring that should bring 40 to 50. I have a small amount of savings from what I've put up from the garden over summer." She looked up at him. "I don't have $240, Mr. Easton, not by the end of this month." Graham drank his coffee. He looked around the kitchen, at the bread rising on the far counter, at the tidy stack of mended shirts near the window, at the daguerreotype of a man he'd never met who had built this place, and then left a woman and 2 children to keep it standing by force of will alone. He should give her the notice. He should tell her she had 60 days to vacate. He should tell her she could contest it in the county court if she had legal standing and money to pay a lawyer, knowing full well she had neither. He should tip his hat and walk back to his horse, and ride toward Wichita and file the paperwork that would transfer the deed to the Voss Land and Capital Company within 90 days. He had done it before. It had not felt good, but he had done it. He looked at Lucy Merritt's face and found that he could not locate the part of himself that had done those other things. It seemed to have stepped out of the room and left him here alone with a cup of excellent coffee and a conscience that was making a great deal of noise. "There may be options," he said carefully. She looked at him with an expression that was wary and tired, and beneath both those things, something fragile that she was working hard not to show. Options like what? He did not have a fully formed answer. What he had was an idea that had only just arrived, and he needed to think it through. "Give me until tomorrow," he said. "I'd like to look at the terms of the original note." She studied him for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" He thought about it honestly. "Because you dug a well in August in Kansas," he said, "and because your coffee is very good, and because I'm not entirely certain that the business I'm conducting this morning is just." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're a strange man to be working for Harlan Voss." "Yes," he said. "I'm beginning to think so myself." He did not give her the foreclosure notice that morning. He rode back to Caldwell and spent the afternoon in the land record's office with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, going through the Merritt file and 3 adjacent files with the kind of attention he hadn't applied to anything in months. The original note had been drawn up by a Voss clerk named Pettigrew, who was enthusiastic about fees and additions that were not standard in land lending. There were penalty clauses stacked on top of penalty clauses. There was an interest rate that sat at the high edge of what Kansas law permitted, and Graham was careful to look at what Kansas law actually permitted, because he hadn't thought to do that before. He also wrote a letter to a man he knew in Wichita, an attorney named Caldecott who owed Graham a professional favor from 2 years prior and who was not in Voss's pocket. He stayed in Caldwell that night and could not sleep well. He lay in the narrow boarding house bed and thought about a woman with flour on her apron telling him the truth of things without asking for his sympathy. and about a boy of 8 with his dead father's serious eyes, and about 340 acres of good land along a creek that was worth every bit of someone's care. He was back at the Merritt homestead by 9 in the morning with a copy of the note, a set of calculations he'd done by lamplight and no clear plan beyond being honest. Lucy Merritt opened the door before he even knocked. She had seen him coming up the trail from the window. She stood there in a different dress, a brown one this time, still plain, still practical, and she looked at him and said, "You came back." "I said I would," he said. Something in her expression did something that he couldn't quite name. It was not relief exactly, and it was not surprise exactly. It was more like she was noting the fact of his word meaning what it said and filing it somewhere careful. "Come in," she said. The children were outside this time. Through the kitchen window he could see Thomas doing something purposeful with a fence post, and the girl, whose name he did not yet know, sitting in the dirt nearby with a doll that had seen better days but was clearly much loved. He spread his papers on the kitchen table, and Lucy leaned over to look at them, and he walked her through what he'd found. The penalty structure in the original note was aggressive, but there was an error in the calculation of the second missed payment. Pettigrew had applied the full penalty rate to a payment that had actually come in partial and late, not missed entirely. The distinction mattered by $42. That brought the total current balance to just under $200. Lucy listened to all of this with her hands flat on the table and her eyes moving over his papers. When he finished, she straightened up and looked at him steadily. "Does your employer know about this error?" "Not yet," Graham said, "and possibly he never needs to if we can come to a different arrangement." "What arrangement?" He folded his hands. This was the part he had actually been thinking about since 3 in the morning, when sleep had given up on him entirely. The Merritt land has creek access that makes it valuable to Voss for a cattle operation he's building. What Voss wants is the water rights and a passage corridor along the lower creek. He doesn't actually need the house or the home quarter of land. He paused. If you were willing to sell a portion of the land, the lower 60 acres and the water rights corridor, at fair market value, that money would clear the debt, clear the penalties, and leave you with enough to carry through the winter and make the next 2 payments from a solid position. She was quiet, thinking. "And Voss agrees to this?" "I believe I can present it to him in a way that makes sense to his interests," Graham said. "Which it does, honestly. He gets what he actually wants, which is the water access without the cost of a legal contest if you choose to fight the foreclosure. He wouldn't like being told he has to negotiate," she said. "No," Graham agreed, "but he likes losing money even less. And a court contest on a flawed note with a widow and 2 children and a sympathetic county judge is a risk he won't enjoy." Lucy looked at him for a long time. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window and falling across the table between them, and in it Graham could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into a bright sky and the steady, careful quality of her thinking. "You're putting yourself at risk doing this," she said. "If Voss finds out you came back here instead of filing yesterday—" "I know," he said. "I've thought about that." "Why?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked him the day before, and this time she pressed a little harder. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Graham thought about how to answer that honestly. He was a careful man with words in most situations, but something about sitting at this table, in this kitchen across from this woman, made him less careful than usual in a way that felt, strangely, like relief. "Because I've done this job for 3 years," he said. "And I've gotten very good at not looking at the particulars, at not seeing the well that somebody dug with their own hands, or the fence someone mended 10 times over, or the—" He stopped, looked down at his hands. "Because I looked at the particulars this time, and I can't unlook at them. And because I don't think what Voss is doing here is right, and I've been telling myself for 3 years that right and wrong weren't the variables I was working with." Lucy did not say anything immediately. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him from the beginning, with that clear and unhurried assessment, as if she had a very good internal measure and she was taking his weight with it. "I'll accept your proposal," she said finally. if you can get Voss to agree. I'll leave for Wichita this afternoon, he said, and if he won't agree, he met her eyes, then I'll tell you and we'll look at what else can be done. She nodded once slowly. Then she said, have some coffee before you go. He stayed for an hour. He was not entirely sure how it happened. They drank coffee, and then she took him out to show him the fence line so he could describe the lower pasture accurately to Voss, and Thomas came along and peppered him with questions about Wichita that Graham answered seriously, because the boy deserved serious answers. The girl's name was Clara, and she showed Graham her doll and explained at length about the doll's history and preferences, which he listened to with complete attention while trying to understand why standing in a cold October barnyard hearing about a doll's favorite subject felt more real than anything he'd done in years. When he finally got on his horse, Lucy was standing at the gate, and she shaded her eyes against the watery autumn sun to look up at him. "Mr. Easton," she said. "Graham," he said before he could think about whether that was appropriate. She looked at him with a faint shift of expression, almost something. "Graham," she said, "thank you." He rode back toward Caldwell feeling like a man who has been standing in a dark room and has just remembered where the lamp is. The ride to Wichita took 2 days, and Graham spent both of them thinking with unusual clarity. He had his calculations. He had the argument. He had also written out, in careful detail, the discrepancies in the Pettigrew note, and he had made a copy which he had mailed to Caldecott before leaving Caldwell, with a letter explaining the situation and asking Caldecott to hold it pending developments. This was, he knew, something close to a declaration of intent. If he came home to Wichita with Voss's agreement, the copy would sit in Caldecott's file and never need to be used. If he came home having failed, or if Voss found out what he'd done and decided to make an example of him, then he had some small insurance that the matter could be raised in the right legal quarters. He was not naive about what he was doing. Harlan Voss was a powerful man with a long memory and short patience for anyone he felt had crossed him. Graham had seen what happened to men who stopped being useful to Voss, but he was also no longer willing to be the kind of man he had been becoming, one competent and careful delivery of a devastating notice at a time. He had thought about this the previous night and had not been able to find his way to a different conclusion. He thought about it again on the second day's ride and arrived in Wichita with it settled. Voss's office was on the second floor of a stone building on Douglas Avenue, the kind of office that expressed its owner's prosperity in every carefully chosen detail. The walnut desk, the leather chair, the framed land maps on the wall that looked like a general's campaign charts. Voss himself was 53, a heavy-shouldered man with a gray beard cropped close, and the eyes of someone who had decided very early that the world was a transaction and had never since questioned that framework. He looked up when Graham came in. "Easton," he said, "you took your time. The Merritt filing should have been in 2 days ago." "It's why I'm here," Graham said. He sat down without being invited to, which was the kind of small signal Voss noticed. "I've found a better arrangement for your interests than the foreclosure." Voss leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening." Graham laid out the case. He was precise and financial and kept his language entirely in the register of profit and risk, because that was the only register Voss truly heard. The water rights in the lower corridor were what Voss needed for the basin operation. A contested foreclosure, and Graham presented the note discrepancy carefully, not as moral failing but as legal exposure, could tie up the land for 6 months to a year in county court, during which the basin operations timeline would be impacted. A direct purchase of the 60 acres and water rights at fair value, set against the debt, resolved everything in 30 days. Voss listened without expression. He asked 2 questions, both about numbers. Then he said, "You're asking me to negotiate with a widow who can't pay her debts. I'm asking you to acquire what you actually need at a fair price without legal risk," Graham said. "The widow is incidental." Voss looked at him for a moment. "You've gotten attached, Easton. "I've gotten practical," Graham said, keeping his voice flat. "The note has a flaw Pettigrew should have caught. If I were the opposing counsel, I'd have this in front of a judge inside a month. The sympathy of a jury to a widow and 2 young children in a dry year is not a calculation you want to make." Voss was quiet for what felt like a long time. Graham sat still, meeting his eyes, and thought about Thomas with his serious face and Clara with her doll and Lucy standing at the gate in the October light. "Fine," Voss said at last. "Draft the offer. 60 acres and full water rights at market rate, applied against the debt. She keeps the rest." "Yes," Graham said. "And Easton," Voss said as Graham stood. "This is the last time I want a note contested from inside my own office." Graham picked up his hat. "Understood," he said. What he understood and what he did not say to Voss was that it was also the last time he would sit in that chair. But he had one more thing to attend to first. He drafted the offer that afternoon with a precision that felt, for the first time in years, like work he could be proud of. He had it signed and witnessed by morning. He sent word to Caldecott that the matter was resolved favorably. He packed his personal items from the room he had kept in Wichita. There wasn't much, a modest indication of how sparely he'd been living, and he settled his accounts. And 3 days after riding into Voss's office, he was on the road back to Clearwater Flats. He told himself he was going back to deliver the agreement and finalize the terms with Lucy Merritt and ensure the transaction was properly recorded at the land office. All of which was true. He also told himself that was the only reason he was riding at a slightly faster pace than was strictly necessary. That was less convincingly true. It was late afternoon when he came up the trail to the Merritt homestead again, and this time Lucy was outside, coming from the barn with a bucket when she saw him. She stopped walking. She watched him come up to the gate, and he dismounted and tied the horse, and she was still standing there when he walked through. "You came back again," she said. "I said I would," he said for the second time, and this time the look she gave him was something more, something that had moved past wariness into territory he couldn't name but felt the shape of very clearly. He took out the offer document. "Voss has agreed. 60 acres along the lower pasture and the creek corridor. The price applied against the debt brings your total balance to zero and leaves a surplus of $41 that will be paid to you directly." She looked at the document. Her hands were steady, but she had gone very still in the way of someone managing a large emotion carefully. He watched her read through it twice methodically, and he noticed that she understood every clause, because she had a sharper mind than most men he worked with gave their business counterparts credit for. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that she seemed to be firmly declining to apologize for. "It's real," she said. "This is real." "It is," he said. "Thomas," she called, turning toward the house, and there was something in her voice that her son must have recognized because he came out at a run, with Clara behind him. "We're all right," Lucy said when Thomas reached her, and something broke open in the boy's expression that told Graham with perfect clarity how long Thomas had been carrying the weight of knowing they might not be. She put her arm around him and he leaned in against her side, and Graham looked away, feeling like an intruder in a private moment, and also like he was witnessing something that would stay with him indefinitely. "Thank you," Lucy said, looking at him over Thomas's head. Graham. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried in a very long time. He was standing in a barnyard in October with dried mud on his boots and a horse that needed water, and he was fighting off the distinct and inconvenient feeling that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "The papers need to be signed and recorded at the land office in Caldwell," he said, because professional matter was the safer ground. "I can take them in tomorrow if you want to come." "I'll come," she said. They had supper that evening because Lucy said it was getting dark and she asked if he'd eaten, and he said not since noon, which was true. He sat at the kitchen table with Thomas and Clara and Lucy, and they had salt pork and cornbread and the last of the kitchen garden's carrots, and Thomas asked him 7 more questions about Wichita, and whether Graham had ever been in a gunfight, to which Graham said honestly no, and Thomas seemed faintly disappointed and faintly relieved in equal measure. Clara fell asleep at the table before the meal was finished, and Lucy carried her upstairs, and Thomas went up shortly after with the air of a boy who has held up under a great weight and is now, for the first time in a while, allowed to set it down and rest. When Lucy came back downstairs, the kitchen was quiet and she sat at the table and looked at the signed offer document still lying there. "He's been trying to be the man of the house since his father died," she said. "He's 8 years old. He's doing a remarkable job," Graham said. "He should be playing." She looked at the document. "He will be able to now, or more than before at least." She glanced up. "What happens to you after this?" He had been thinking about how to answer that question. He answered it honestly. "I've left the Voss company." She was quiet for a moment. "Because of this." "Because of several things," he said. This was the one that made it clear. "What will you do?" "I'm not entirely certain," he said. "I have some money saved. I have skills that are useful in legitimate land work, surveying, title work, accounting for ranch operations." He paused. "I've been thinking about the Clearwater Flats area, actually. There's a need for honest land work here. The railroad brought a lot of Voss's kind of transaction along with it." She was looking at him with that clear, careful look. "You're thinking about staying?" "I'm thinking about it," he said. "Why?" She asked, and it was the same question again. The third time she had asked it, and each time it had meant something slightly different. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the bread smell still in the air, and the sounds of an old house settling in the cold night outside. He thought about being honest again, the way he'd been honest with her since the beginning, because apparently he was incapable of being anything else in her presence. "Because I've been living like a man passing through for 3 years," he said quietly. "And this is the first place I've sat still long enough to notice that I don't want to be passing through anymore." Lucy looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The lamp between them burned low and steady. "That's a lot to say across a kitchen table," she said at last, not dismissive. "Careful." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry if that's—" "Don't apologize," she said. "I'm not uncomfortable, I'm just—" She stopped. Something in her expression was working through something complex and private. "James has been gone 14 months. Some people in town have opinions about what's proper." She said it matter-of-factly, without the bitterness it might have carried. "I don't find that I care much about their opinions. I find that I care about my children and my land and my own judgment in that order." "Your judgment seems very sound to me," he said. That almost smile moved across her face, the one he'd been seeing glimpses of since the first day. "You've known me 4 days," she said. "Yes," he said. 4 very instructive days." She laughed then, the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that came from a real place, surprised out of her. It changed her face entirely. It was warm and quick and genuine, and it hit Graham somewhere below his ribs with the force of something he was not going to be able to ignore. She pressed her lips together after, steadying herself, but her eyes were still bright. "You should sleep in the barn tonight," she said. "It's too cold and too dark to ride back to Caldwell, and the loft is dry." She stood, gathering the coffee cups. "Don't read too much into the barn." "I wouldn't dream of it," he said. "Good," she said. But she was smiling when she said it, and he saw it in her profile as she turned to the stove. The next morning, they rode to Caldwell together and filed the documents at the land office. And the transaction was made official. And the Merritt land, 280 acres of it, was free and clear, and belonging entirely to Lucy Merritt. The land recorder, an old man named Birch with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked at the papers, looked at Lucy, looked at Graham and said, "This is unusual paperwork from the Voss company." "It's an unusual situation," Graham said. Birch stamped it without further comment. They rode back largely in silence, which was not the uncomfortable kind but the kind where two people are thinking parallel thoughts and not finding it necessary to fill the air. The Kansas plains spread out around them in the pale November light, and the sky was enormous and clean, And Graham thought that if a man was going to decide where to plant himself in the world, he could do much worse than here. When they came back to the homestead, Lucy surprised him. She stopped her horse at the gate and turned to look at him. "Are you going to Caldwell tonight?" she asked. "I should," he said. "Settle up with the boarding house, collect my things, write a letter I owe." "There's a town meeting Thursday evening," she said. "The ranchers along the basin are trying to form a cooperative agreement about the water rights, the ones Voss now partially holds. They need someone who understands land law to help draft the terms." She looked at him steadily. "I told Mrs. Home that I might know such a person." "Did you?" he said. "I may have been somewhat confident," she said, "given that this person had mentioned an interest in staying in the area and engaging in honest land work." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The horse shifted under him and the wind moved her loose hair, and she was, in the morning light, so completely herself that he felt he had never seen a person more clearly. "I'll be here Thursday," he said. "Good," she said. She turned her horse toward the barn and he watched her go, and he was smiling in a way that he could feel in his entire face. He spent the next 2 days in Caldwell. He collected his things from the boarding house. He wrote the letter to his mother in Missouri that he had been putting off for 6 months, which told her, among other things, that he had left his employment with the Voss Company and was settling in Clearwater Flats. He wrote to Caldecott and formally closed the matter of the Merritt note, and thanked him for holding the documents. He walked through Caldwell with different eyes than he'd had before, looking at it as a place he might be a part of rather than a way station. It was a small town, grown in the last few years with railroad commerce. There was a general store, a post office, a church that served 3 denominations on a rotating Sunday schedule, a doctor who was also the dentist and who had a reputation for being very good at one and adequate at the other, a livery stable, 2 saloons that Graham was not particularly interested in, and a modest land office that was attached to the courthouse. The courthouse, he learned, had a position open for a land and title recorder's assistant. The previous man had gone north to Dodge City when his wife's family called for them. Graham walked into the courthouse on Tuesday morning and spoke to the county clerk, a practical woman named Mrs. Fontaine, who interviewed him for 20 minutes and offered him the position, contingent on a 1-month trial period, at a salary that was modest but honest. He accepted. He found a room to board with a family named Hutchins on the north end of town, a quiet arrangement that suited him well. He bought a new hat because his old one had been beaten past salvage by the November wind. He found himself humming something unidentifiable while brushing his horse Tuesday evening, which was unusual enough that the horse turned to look at him. Thursday evening, he rode out to the Merritt homestead, and they went together to the town meeting at the community hall, a wooden building near the church that smelled of sawdust and lantern oil and gathered people. There were 12 ranchers there, mostly older men who had been working this land for years and who watched Graham with the measured suspicion due any newcomer, but also with the particular attention of people who have a problem and are wondering if this stranger might be useful. Lucy had told them something of his background and the resolution of her situation with Voss, and the word that a Voss man had turned over and helped a widow neighbor carried both weight and interest. An old rancher named Clarence Briggs, who ran the largest remaining independent operation on the basin, asked Graham 3 pointed questions about water rights law in Kansas, and seemed satisfied with the answers. They worked for 3 hours at a long table with papers and a lamp and coffee that someone's wife kept refilling, and by the end of it, Graham had a rough framework for a cooperative water use agreement that Briggs and 2 others agreed to look over and bring back with comments. It was good, honest work, and Graham felt the satisfaction of it deep in his bones. Walking back to their horses afterward, Lucy said, "Briggs asked me after the meeting if you were staying permanently." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought so," she said. "Was that presumptuous of me?" "No," he said. "It was accurate. She looked at him in the dark, with the community hall light coming through the window behind her and making everything softer and warmer than the November cold had any right to allow. "Graham," she said. "Yes." She hesitated in a way he had not seen from her before. She was not a hesitating woman by nature, and the sight of it moved him. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I don't know another way." "Please," he said. "I've been alone for 14 months, she said. "And before that, I was someone's wife for 9 years, and a good part of that was good, and a hard part of that was hard the way all things with another person are hard. And when James died, I thought—" She paused. "I thought the most important thing was the land and the children, and it still is. But I also think—" She stopped again and looked at him, and then seemed to decide to simply say it. "I like you. I don't say that easily. And I think you like me. And I don't see any good reason to be cautious about saying so, because life is short, and I have had excellent recent evidence that things can change very quickly." Graham stood there in the cold outside a community hall in Clearwater Flats, Kansas, in the year 1882, and felt something settle into place inside him with a quiet, final weight, like a cornerstone being set. "I like you very much," he said. "I would like to court you properly if you'll allow it, which means being present and honest with you and presumably enduring more very thorough questioning from Thomas." She laughed that real laugh again. "He has a list," she confirmed. "I've seen it." "I look forward to it," Graham said, and meant it entirely. He began to call at the Merritt homestead 3 evenings a week, in addition to Sundays, when he would come for the midday meal and stay into the afternoon. He was scrupulous about propriety, not because the gossip concerned him, but because Lucy's position in the community mattered to her children's place in it, and he was not willing to be the cause of any difficulty for her. He brought small, practical things when he came: a new hinge for the barn door that he'd noticed was failing, a book on wild grass management that he found at the Caldwell General Store and thought Thomas would genuinely use, a length of blue ribbon for Clara, because he had seen her looking at a piece of blue cloth in the store window with the expression of a child who has learned not to ask for things that are pretty but not necessary. Clara looked at the ribbon for a moment when he handed it to her, and then looked at him with the pure, undiluted sincerity of a 6-year-old and said, "You're nice," in a tone that suggested this was both a compliment and a piece of serious reporting. Thomas remained measured. He asked Graham his questions one evening after supper, a genuine, handwritten list, as Lucy had promised, and Graham answered them seriously and honestly, including the 2 questions that were clearly about his intentions toward Thomas's mother, which were the ones that mattered. Thomas listened to all of the answers, put his list away in his pocket, and then said, after a considered moment, "Papa used to say that a man you could trust was worth more than a man who said all the right things." "Your papa was right," Graham said. Thomas nodded once, the same way his mother nodded when she had received and filed a satisfactory answer. The family resemblance was striking and very dear. November moved into December, and the Kansas winter settled over the basin with hard frosts that turned the creek grass silver in the mornings. Graham helped Lucy put the barn in proper order for the winter. It needed new chinking between the boards on the north side, and the hay loft had a soft section in the floor that he replaced on a Saturday with Thomas handing him nails. They worked together well, Graham and Lucy, with the kind of natural efficiency that only happens when 2 people's instincts are compatible, when one moves without the other needing to ask them to. One afternoon in December, they were mending fence along the boundary of the property that had been sold, marking the new line with stakes per the surveyor's record, and the cold had made Lucy's cheeks red and her breath made small clouds in the air, and she was entirely focused on driving a stake with a mallet, and she was, Graham thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. He said, "I need to tell you something." She stopped mauling and looked at him. He had been thinking about how to say this for about 3 weeks and had not improved on the direct approach. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I know that may seem like very quick work, Given that it's been about 2 months since I rode up to your door with documents I was thankful not to deliver. But I want you to know that it doesn't feel quick to me. It feels like something that's been building since the moment you handed me that coffee, and the thing I had prepared to say left my head entirely." Lucy looked at him. The mallet was in her hand, and the wind was moving through the winter grass, and the sky was enormous and gray and clear overhead. "That did seem to work rather well on you," she said. "It absolutely destroyed me," he said. "I had a whole speech." "I know," she said. "I could see it on your face when it fell apart." She was looking at him with those clear, warm eyes, and the thing that had been building between them since October was right here now, right in this cold field, undeniable and present. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for 3 weeks, and I've been waiting for you to say it first because I had already been the one who said the plain thing at the community hall, and it seemed like your turn." "That seems fair," he said. "I'm a very fair person," she said. He kissed her there in the cold field with the fence posts they'd been setting, and the winter grass, and the enormous Kansas sky. And she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything. And it was warm despite the frost, and real in a way that matched everything else between them, honest and solid and genuinely felt. They were engaged by February. It had not required a great deal of ceremony between two practical people who already knew their own minds. He had asked her one evening after the children were in bed, not with anything elaborate but with a ring he'd bought from a jeweler in Caldwell, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, because he'd noticed she wore red in the kitchen garden sometimes, and he thought the color suited her. And he had said that he wanted to spend his life on this land with her, and with Thomas and Clara, if she would have him, and that he intended to be a man worth having. She had looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she had said, "Yes, I will have you, Graham Easton. I believe you'll do very well." He had laughed and put the ring on her finger, and she had looked at it there in the lamplight with a softness on her face that she let him see completely, without reserve. And that was the moment that he believed everything in his life had been pointing him toward this kitchen, this woman, this ring, this place. They were married in April of 1883, at the small church in Caldwell on a Sunday, when the entire Basin community seemed to turn out. Because a widow keeping her land and marrying the man who had been sent to take it was the kind of story people wanted to see have a good ending. Clarence Briggs stood up for Graham as best man, which had surprised Graham considerably when it was offered, but Briggs had said simply, "You're the man who helped us with the water agreement, and you didn't charge us a cent for it, Easton. That means something out here." Lucy wore a dress she had made herself from white cotton and cream calico trim, and she had done her dark hair up with small dried flowers that Clara had helped her choose and arrange. And she walked into that small wooden church and looked at Graham standing at the front of it and smiled at him with her entire face, the kind of smile she didn't give to many people. And Graham stood there receiving it and felt something in his chest that was too big for his body to hold easily. Thomas walked Lucy down the aisle because she asked him to. He did it with a dignity that was entirely his own, serious and careful and deeply proud. And when he had seen his mother to Graham's side, he gave Graham a single, significant look before going to his seat, a look that communicated with perfect clarity that Graham was being trusted with something irreplaceable and was expected to know it. Graham knew it. The vows, they said, were the traditional words, but when it came to the part where Graham was to speak his own addition, because the Reverend had told them both they could say something personal if they wished, he said, "I came to your door with papers that should have taken everything from you, and you handed me coffee, and everything I thought I knew about where I was going and what I was doing became entirely uncertain. I am very grateful for that uncertainty. I am very grateful for you. I intend to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that first cup of coffee and every one that has come after." There was a sound from the gathered congregation that was part laughter and part moved silence, the sound of people who are witnessing something true. Lucy looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "You have been, Graham, from the very beginning. The reception was held in the community hall, the same one where they'd had the water meeting, and someone had put wildflowers on the tables, and the ranchers' wives had collectively produced a quantity of food that suggested the Clearwater Flats basin contained hidden depths of culinary talent that the land's reputation for hardship had not adequately reflected. There was fiddle music and someone's harmonica, and Thomas danced with Clara with the exasperated good humor of an older sibling who has been asked to dance but is secretly pleased to be asked. Graham danced with Lucy, and she was warm and real in his arms, and she said, close to his ear, "I keep thinking I should find something to fuss over so I don't stand here grinning like a fool." "I keep thinking the same thing," he said. "We're a practical pair," she said. "We are," he said. "It's going to serve us very well." The spring of 1883 was the best planting season the basin had seen in 4 years. The secondary well Lucy had dug had proven itself sound and clean, and Graham spent a month in early spring running new pipe from it to the barn and the kitchen garden with Thomas's constant and increasingly competent assistance. The water agreement that Graham had drafted came fully into effect, and the ranchers along the basin were navigating their arrangement with the water corridor that was now technically under the Voss Company's rights with the legal tools Graham had built for them, which meant Voss was getting his access but could not simply absorb further land by leveraging the water. Graham's work at the land office had grown in scope. The county clerk had hired him formally at the end of his trial month and had given him increasing responsibility for title work as his knowledge of the local land records became thorough. He had also picked up private clients, the basin ranchers, and a growing number of small homesteaders who needed honest help with notes, titles, and boundary surveys. He was good at it and he was fair, and word of that moved through a community the way water does, finding every crack. They were busy, and it was good work. The life they were building on the Merritt land, which Graham never suggested renaming, because it was Lucy's and her children's before it was his and that mattered, was filling in like a sketch that gains detail, every month adding something new. Summer came hot and dry the way Kansas summers do, unapologetically and all at once. Graham rode the fence lines with Thomas in the mornings before the worst of the heat, and in the evenings he and Lucy would sometimes sit on the porch after the children were in bed and watch the stars appear over the plains in their vast and indifferent beauty. They talked on those evenings about everything, about the land and the operation, about the water agreement and the politics of the basin community, about Thomas's progress with his reading and Clara's insistence on adding a kitten to the household, which had ultimately succeeded, the kitten being called Button, and ruling the kitchen with imperious warmth, about Missouri and what Graham's mother had written in her last letter, about James and what Lucy had felt in the year after losing him and what she felt now. They were honest with each other in those conversations, in the way that only happens when two people have decided fully that honesty is the only currency worth trading in. Sometimes they disagreed, and they discovered that disagreeing well was something they were both capable of, not easily and not without friction, but with the underlying knowledge that the disagreement was about the thing itself and not about whether they were on the same side. They were on the same side. That was the foundation. One August evening, when the heat had finally broken and there was a faint, merciful wind from the north, Lucy told him she was expecting. He was sitting next to her on the porch, and she said it the way she said most important things, plainly, looking at him, gauging his response with the same careful attention she brought to everything. His response was immediate and felt and fully genuine. He took her hands, both of them, and held them. "Are you happy?" she asked, and the small uncertainty in it, the first small uncertainty he had ever seen her wear openly, was so precious to him that he felt it like something luminous. "Beyond every reasonable description," he said. "Are you? How are you feeling?" She let out a slow breath. "Terrified," she said, and then smiled. "And happy, both at once." "That seems like the appropriate response," he said, and she laughed, and he brought her hands to his lips and kissed them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder under the enormous Kansas stars, and they sat like that for a long time while the night cooled around them. Thomas received the news with the expression of a boy who is recalibrating several things at once, but who arrives at a positive position. He asked practical and relatively sophisticated questions about the timing and the logistics, several of which Graham answered with honest uncertainty. Clara announced that she would be the baby's most important teacher, and that Button the cat would also help, which seemed to settle the matter to her satisfaction. The pregnancy was healthy, and Lucy carried it with the same no-nonsense capability she brought to everything, though Graham noticed that she allowed herself to be helped more than she had before, to accept his hand and his presence in ways that told him she was learning, slowly and by choice, to let someone else carry some of the weight. He understood what it cost her. She had carried everything alone for so long, and he was careful to be steady enough that the choice felt safe. In March of 1884, their son was born. He came into the world in the bedroom of the Merritt farmhouse, with the help of the Caldwell doctor and Mrs. Home from the Basin community who had attended births for 30 years, and whose calm practicality was the most reassuring thing in the room during the several hours that Graham spent being considerably less calm in the kitchen downstairs, while Thomas explained to him, with kind intention, that it was going to be all right. "How do you know?" Graham asked, in a moment of stripped-back honesty. "Because Mama handles everything," Thomas said simply, and Graham had to concede that this was historically accurate. The boy was named James Daniel Easton James for his mother's first husband, because Lucy said it was right that her children's father be remembered in the family, and Daniel for Graham's own father, who had died when Graham was 15, and whom he had loved and missed in ways that he had never found the right occasion to say. Lucy had thought of both names herself and told him, and the care in it undid him. James Daniel was a solid, vigorous baby who arrived with dark hair and the look of a person who has strong opinions and is only just getting started on expressing them. Clara claimed exclusive credit for his clearly excellent temperament and logged approximately 400 hours in the first 6 weeks teaching him things he was unable to understand or act on, with complete satisfaction. Thomas held him the first evening with the focused, serious care of a boy who understands the weight of what he's carrying, and looked up at Graham over the baby's head and said, quietly, "We have a good family." "Yes," Graham said, "we do." The land continued its life around them. The second spring after the water agreement, the Basin ranchers had their best collective season in a decade, and Voss's access corridor proved less useful to his operation than he'd hoped, largely because Graham had drafted the access terms with sufficient precision that Voss could not extend them unilaterally. Graham heard from Caldecott in Wichita that Voss had said something unflattering about him to a mutual acquaintance, which Graham filed away without particular emotion. Voss was a transaction to him now, something resolved, not something ongoing. The thing that was ongoing was everything here, this land, this family. The way Lucy looked in the morning kitchen with coffee already made and the children still sleeping, and the dawn coming in through the eastern window. The way Thomas, at nearly 11, had begun to develop an interest in surveying that Graham was cautiously, carefully encouraging, because the boy had a good eye and a precise mind, and should be allowed to grow into whatever he was growing into. The way Clara, 8 years old and deeply convinced of her own authority over all things natural and domestic, had organized the kitchen garden into a production of impressive efficiency, and was applying the same energy to managing Button's social life. The weight and warmth of his son in his arms, and the way the baby had begun to smile, whole-faced and absolute, at the people who belonged to him. There was an afternoon in May, the kind of afternoon that the Kansas spring occasionally manufactures to suggest that all the rest of the weather was a misunderstanding, where the light was golden and the air was warm, and the cottonwoods along the creek were new-leaved, and the whole world smelled like earth and growing things, that Graham was coming up from the creek pasture, and he saw Lucy at the fence watching him come. With James on her hip and Clara's voice audible from somewhere behind the barn and Thomas visible in the distance doing something with a measuring cord and a stake, and the whole scene was simply life, ordinary, particular, entirely real. And he stopped walking for a moment and stood there with the sun on his face and felt something that he was not sure had a name precisely, only that it was profound and whole and sufficient, the feeling of a man who has found where he belongs and knows it without reservation. Lucy watched him stop and saw whatever was on his face, and her expression across the distance between them was warm and knowing, because she had the same thing in her. "What are you doing standing out there?" she called. "Looking at everything," he said. She shifted James on her hip, and he reached for her hair with the confident grip of a baby who has decided that hair is an excellent tool. "Well, come look at it from closer," she said. "There's coffee." He walked toward her and she watched him come, and when he reached the fence she stepped into him with James between them, and the baby patted Graham's face with a very small hand, and Lucy looked up at him with those clear brown eyes that had been looking at him honestly since the day they met. "Are you happy?" she asked, the same question she had asked him in August on the porch, the small one that held everything inside it. "Entirely," he said. "More than I know what to do with." She smiled at him, the full, warm, real smile that she gave to very few people, and had given to him since February in a snowy field with a mallet in her hand. "Good," she said. "That's exactly the right amount." He kissed her at the fence with his son patting at their faces, and Clara's voice rising from behind the barn in what sounded like an instructional lecture to the chickens and Thomas's careful footsteps in the distance. And the Kansas sky enormous and blue above all of it. And the land Lucy's land, their land now. The land she had fought to keep, and that he had found his way back to again and again, as if it had been pulling him spread in every direction, solid and alive and entirely, completely theirs. In the fall of 1885, the water agreement that Graham had drafted became the basis for a county-level model that 3 additional basin areas adopted, with Graham's consultation and a modest fee that helped considerably with the roof, repair the farmhouse had needed since spring. Clarence Briggs recommended Graham formally to the Kansas Land Settlement Commission as someone worth consulting on fair title practices, and Graham went to Wichita for a week in October to speak to the commission, staying with Caldecott and his family, and came back with a small standing appointment that would take him to Wichita 2 or 3 times a year for work that he was genuinely proud of. He came home on a Thursday evening to find Lucy had made the good soup, the kind with the dried beans she kept for occasions, and Thomas had beaten him to the stable and was unsaddling his horse with the easy competence of a 13-year-old who has been doing it long enough to be faster at it than most adults. Clara had made a welcome-home drawing that featured, as far as Graham could interpret, himself on a horse, Lucy and the children, Button the cat, now elderly and dignified, and what appeared to be either the farmhouse or a large hat. He put it on the kitchen shelf next to the daguerreotype of James Merritt, because it belonged there. James Daniel, a year and a half old and walking with the enthused, unsteady confidence of a person who has only recently discovered the application and intends to fully commit to it, got up from the kitchen floor and walked toward Graham with his arms out and the expression of someone who has been waiting for this specifically and is pleased it has arrived. Graham picked him up and the boy grabbed his ear and said, clearly and with great feeling, "Papa." Graham had heard this for about 3 months now, and it still, every time, reached him somewhere fundamental. "Hello, James," he said. "Did you have a good week?" James Daniel offered a detailed account in a language that was approximately half real words and half something all his own, delivered with complete conviction. "That sounds excellent," Graham said seriously. Lucy appeared from the back room where she'd been, and she looked at him the way she always did when he first came home, that clear, warm look that said she was glad he was back, said it without sentiment or performance, just the plain fact of it. She had flour on her apron. She nearly always had flour on her apron, and he had loved the sight of it from the very first morning. "Good trip," she said. "Very good," he said. "They want me back in February." "That's good work, Graham." "It's your doing," he said. "If you hadn't handed me that coffee." She made a sound that was half dismissal and half amusement. "If you hadn't come back the second morning." "Because you dug a well in August in Kansas," he said, which had become something between them, a shorthand for all of it for the beginning. "Sit down," she said. "Soup's ready." He sat at the kitchen table where he had sat on the first morning, in the kitchen that was now as familiar to him as any place he had ever been. And Thomas came in from the stable, and Clara came in from wherever Clara had been, and they all sat together and ate in the comfortable, specific noise of a family at the end of a good day. And the lamp burned between them, and the Kansas wind moved outside, and the farmhouse held them, solid and warm. After the children were in bed and James Daniel was settled and the house was quiet, Lucy and Graham sat on the porch as they often did, though October required blankets now, and the coffee was necessary rather than optional. The stars were out in force, the way they are in the plains where there is nothing to compete with them, thick and indifferent and dazzlingly old. "What did the commission say?" Lucy asked. She always asked about the real substance of things. He told her. He told her about the arguments and the politics and the men who were beginning to see that fair land practice was not just right but economically stable, and the men who were not yet there, and what he thought could be moved and what could not. She listened the way she always did, completely, without rushing him, asking precise questions when she had them. When he'd finished, she was quiet a moment, and then she said, "You're doing good work, real work." "I couldn't do it from anywhere else," he said. "I need to come home to it, to here, to this." He looked at her. "To you." She turned to look at him in the starlight and the lamplight from inside spilling soft through the window, and she was beautiful in the way that she had always been, not despite the calluses and the plain dress and the practical manner, but entirely and specifically because of them, because of all the real things that made her precisely herself. "Graham," she said. "Yes." She looked at him with those steady, clear brown eyes that had been looking at him honestly since the moment they met, since she had stood at the door and told him he looked like he could use coffee, since she had handed him the cup and his prepared words had dissolved like sugar in hot water, and he had sat there helpless and grateful at her kitchen table and begun, without knowing it, to come home. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have since before I knew what to do about it." She smiled, the real one, the warm one, the one she didn't give to many, and she leaned against him under the blanket, and he put his arm around her and she tucked in against his side, and they sat like that on the porch of the farmhouse on the Merritt land in Clearwater Flats, Kansas, in the clear October night of 1885, with their children sleeping inside and their life spread out around them in every direction, solid and full and genuinely, completely theirs. The stars were extraordinary. They always were out here. Graham had thought so the very first morning he rowed across the basin, when the sky had been the color of a bruise, and the land had stretched endlessly in all directions, and he had been a man with folded papers in his pocket and prepared words in his head and no idea whatsoever what was about to happen to him. He was very glad for what had happened to him. The windmill turned slowly in the October wind, as it always had, as it would for a long time to come. The house held its warmth. The land ran to the horizon, and then beyond it, 340 acres that had been fought for and kept and built upon, that had a creek running through the lower pasture and new chinking on the barn boards and a kitchen garden that came back every spring with impressive stubbornness, and 2 children who would grow into it, and 1 small boy already growing into it with both hands, and 2 people who had found each other across a kitchen table and a cup of coffee and the honest, irreducible truth of things. It was a good life. It was a hard one sometimes, and it would continue to be both. But it was real and full and built to last, the way the best things are, not on luck or on ease, but on the kind of solid, chosen love that grows in the same soil as everything else worth keeping, watered by honesty and tended by 2 people who have decided, clearly and without reservation, that this is exactly where they are going to be, every single day for the rest of their lives.